Hi, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us for this discussion on 5G and the Internet of Things. We're going to open right now with a fireside chat with the chairman of the FCC, Ajit Pai, and DHS CISA Director, Chris Krebs, and we'll move from that to a panel discussion just so you can follow on what's going on today. So the whole promise of 5G is pretty easy. It's more data, more devices, blazing fast speed, almost zero latency. It's a promise that is bringing the next generation of networks to enhance the Internet of Things even more than how much we love our devices and love using the communications and commerce capabilities. It has the ability to transform transportation, medicine, precision agriculture, and manufacturing, amongst many others. So today, our first guests are the Director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency at the Department of Homeland Security, Chris Krebs. Thanks for joining us. He spent a lot of time reviewing risk involving cybersecurity threats, and one of the key areas for this is supply chain management, which we've been hearing a lot about in the news recently. Supply chain operations are in the next generation network have the ability to be exceptionally fast, but they're going to need to be secure. So we look forward to hearing about that. And our other guest is a great guy from the Midwest, the state below the great state of Nebraska, where I'm from, Kansas. And he's also the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, Ajit Pai. He's been doing some amazing work with his 5G FAST program, which has been pushing more spectrum into the marketplace, updating infrastructure policy, and modernizing outdated regulations. But before we get to 5G, I would love to just talk to you guys for a couple of minutes about what's going on with our current networks and how well they've been handling COVID and what you guys have been doing in the interagency process. So can we start with that? Chairman Pai, how's it going?
Pretty good. Well, first, Shane, thank you so much for hosting this conversation, and to IGF for inviting me. And it's always a pleasure to collaborate and hear from my counterpart and distinguished friend from the DHS, Chris Krebs. Over the last couple of months, especially in March, when I realized we'd be shifting to massive stay-at-home protocols and working from home protocols, that there would be an increase in broadband usage. And that raised a natural question in my mind and the mind of many others. How would our broadband networks hold up? And the answer has been spectacularly well, despite the fact that we've seen a dramatic increase for a time on both fixed and mobile networks. Fixed up to 30% increase, mobile up to 25% increase at peak. Nonetheless, these networks have been structured in such a way to accommodate an even much higher peak. And I think that's really incredible, the fact that we've had hundreds of millions of Americans who, generally speaking, have had a good internet experience to allow them to telework, use telehealth, benefit from distance learning, and the other kinds of things that we use broadband for. That's a testament to the strength of America's broadband networks, as well as the light touch regulatory approach we've had over the last 3.5 years, which has led to increases in capital expenditures to make sure that these broadband networks were strong well before anyone had heard of COVID-19.
Yeah, they've really done an amazing job. One of the things I found really interesting, I know that Comcast did some early statistics about this, is you expected there to be a huge peak, and instead what they found is it was kind of a broadening. So you had, and they looked at really Seattle, LA, and Chicago, and then watched kind of how they needed to change things out. But we really, as far as I can tell, everything's up and going smoothly. Director Krebs, from a cyber perspective, are we feeling pretty good about how things are working on the networks?
Yeah, first off, thanks to IGF for having me. Always good to be with Ajit. He always has better backdrops than me and probably gets better room rater scores.
Did you just have them deliver this to your house? Or are you actually at, did you go to work today?
I'm at the office today. Yeah, I have a couple meetings I got to run downtown for, but I'm in the office today. We have actually, just stepping back for a minute, at CISA, 2,500 employees. We are at about 93% telework and have been in that posture since March 13th. And have actually, I think like everyone else, have actually found ourselves to be incredibly productive. It is a bit maddening. I've got 5 kids, 2 dogs, and it's been a little loud and had to dig out a little corner in the basement. Again, it's not quite as pretty as Ajit's space there. Good scores. You get at least 5 points for your art. And, well, I guess you haven't written a book yet, so I don't have to grade you on the tasteful placement of your own book. But what we were looking at, and I think as Ajit rightly pointed out, was that the networks have absolutely performed as intended. So kudos to American telecommunications infrastructure. But we were absolutely concerned. I know Ajit and I were talking in the first couple of weeks of March, in part looking at San Francisco and the Bay Area and see how they performed. But as the shutdowns and the stay-at-home orders rolled out across the country, no question, not only was the telecommunications infrastructure going to be stressed. I was actually worried about the physical infrastructure. The wastewater, the pipes themselves. Could they handle all that? So what we found was American infrastructure held up, and again, a credit to the United States. On the cybersecurity side, there's absolutely been a increase in activity. We bucketed in generally 3 different categories. First is state actors, and defining that even further into the intelligence services, and you've seen a couple different reports, both tying Russian and Chinese activity of spying on and trying to gain access to COVID therapeutics and vaccine development. And then also the more operator, the military side. And they were probably a little quiet at the beginning. They're key national assets, just like our folks. So saw some back off there. The second piece is cybercrime. Absolutely an increase in cybercrime, particularly around COVID-related themes. Seen a lot of scams, a lot of trying to put hooks into people on whether it's registering for your economic impact payment or registering for a COVID test or an antibody test, or even, hey, get early sign up for a vaccine. And they're any little bit of it pays off. Somebody clicks through, even if it's a 5% success rate, they're getting creds, they're getting money. And the third piece is really, and this is, I think, relevant to this conversation, the disinformation space has been incredibly active, both out of Russia, both out in China. China is trying to rehabilitate their image for some of the missteps they made early on. Russia's, again, just trying to cause chaos here. And then there are a number of other actors, Iran and otherwise, that are involved. On the 5G front, what we found the most interesting was particularly in the UK, where themes were circulating about that COVID emanates from 5G towers. I don't know how that would work, but that's been the claims. Obviously not true, disinformation. We have seen some of those themes being circulated in the United States, in part by white supremacist groups. So we've been working with FCC and others to get awareness out there to the telcos. But we haven't really seen any manifestation or physical damage. But again, it just shows you that it doesn't matter what it is. Disinformation actors are creative, and they prey on conspiracy theories and those that propagate them.
Well, I know that your agencies had worked together before with Puerto Rico and some of the challenges that brought on. And it seems like you're the 2 agencies that really have been able to manage the COVID crisis quite well. Are there any lessons learned that you have for some of your other interagency colleagues? Is it just that you guys seem to work really well together?
I mean, I'd be happy to take that one first unless Chris wants it. But no, look, I met Chris, as he probably remembers, in the fall of 2017 in Puerto Rico. If you remember, I mean, it was, if I remember correctly, it was a restaurant that had been.
It was a Brazilian steakhouse.
Yeah, and it was in the wake of Hurricane Maria, which had just devastated Puerto Rico. And when we shook hands at the beginning and at the end, I think we made a commitment to work together, and that wasn't symbolic. Over the last couple of years, I've had the chance to work with them on a whole bunch of different issues, some of which might seem obvious, 5G security, emergency response, and others, some of which might not be. And I think the fact that we have a direct line of communication with each other, that our teams have collaborated well, speaks to a model of cross-agency cooperation that I think should be the norm on these issues. It's very, very important because the FCC, while it has jurisdiction over certain aspects of these issues, that jurisdiction is not exclusive, and vice versa. And so to the extent that all of us are working together on the same page, the end work product, whatever it is, whether it's guidelines for the industry or a regulatory decision or simply a press release where we advance our views of things, it's much more unified, much more coherent, much more productive. So I very much appreciate the work that Chris has done, and it's been a pleasure to work with him.
Yeah, so, it was funny. I had found out it was the first couple weeks of Maria down in Puerto Rico. I think at that point it was my 3rd trip down. Had heard that Ajit was down on the ground and managed to get his phone number. We met up for for steak, and it was a good partnership. My point really in that conversation was saying, hey, I'm leading the cybersecurity part of the Department of Homeland Security. We have a public-private partnership role. We are the sector-specific agency for comms. This is about working together. There's plenty of room. There's plenty of work on the regulatory side and the enforcement side, and then on the partnership side. So let's figure out how to do this and be the most effective. And so you don't see a lot of competition. What you see is, I think, working together towards a joint purpose. And I think we saw part of that in COVID. One of the early efforts that we undertook at CISA was developing a list of essential critical infrastructure workers. And that came about fairly rapidly, probably over about 36 hours, brought in Ajit's team to take a look at some of the things that we've been doing. But the idea was, based on some analysis we've done across the U.S. critical infrastructure space over the last 15 plus years, contrary to maybe some of our European partners where they see critical infrastructure as maybe 6 or 7 sectors, we have historically viewed it much larger, classically American, 16, 17, 18 infrastructure sector. So we had a really good idea or sense of what the key services and functions as a part of the economy, what made up the economy. And so over the course, again, 36 hours, we were able to distill down what we thought those essential functions or services were, who the critical workers are that supported them, and then get out a list at or in front of some governors that were going to issue these stay-at-home or shelter-in-place orders. And this was, just to be clear, this was not a regulation. This was not a mandatory list. This was guidance. This was, hey, this is our best foot forward as a federal government. Take this as you're formulating, as the critical infrastructure experts for the United States government, take this into consideration. And what we saw over time was 42 states took some kind of stay-at-home or shelter-in-place order, and of those, 35 adopted our list. And I was pretty proud of that. It said to me that we had something going here. And really, for the comms sector, what it did was highlight critical workers like folks that would maintain lines, folks that would maintain call centers, both in the commercial side as well as in the public safety side, as well as in some cases retail stores for handsets to get out to consumers that had communication requirements. So, we're in the process right now of updating the list. I think we're on 3.1 right now. We're going through a process to look towards the fall to see, hey, what is the second wave, or what does school reopenings look like, and how do we need to include some of these different sorts of opinions. So 4.0 is definitely on the horizon for us.
And Chairman Pai, can you talk a little bit about telehealth? Because you've done some similar work at the FCC and breaking down some of the regulatory barriers so people could continue to get health care while staying at home or not having immediate access to their doctors.
Absolutely. I've long championed telehealth and connected care generally as one of the key applications of broadband, and I think the pandemic has only underscored that. In early March, once it became apparent, of course, that healthcare workers would want to minimize exposure in a bricks and mortar facility, and that both COVID positive and non-COVID positive patients would not want to necessarily go into a facility for treatment, we came up with the idea, and we pitched Congress on it for the FCC to have authority and funding to do a telehealth program. And Congress followed up on that suggestion. They passed the CARES Act, which included, among other things, $200 million for the FCC to establish the COVID-19 telehealth program. We did that. Congress passed the law on a Thursday. The President signed it on Friday. The following Monday, I presented to my fellow commissioners a plan for executing on that authority. The commissioners passed it the following day, Tuesday. And now, just a few weeks ago, we approved the 14th and final round of applications in that program to get 539 healthcare providers, all $200 million of that funding in some 47 states in the territory of Guam, as well as the District of Columbia. And from everything from mental health consultations to child transplant, connected care, it's really been incredible to see some of the different innovative uses that healthcare providers are putting this funding to. And my hope is, coming out of the pandemic, that number one, we make this the norm, to focus our efforts on telehealth, and also to break down some of the other barriers that may be beyond the FCC's bailiwick. Interstate licensing, for example, for medical professionals, the reimbursement, making sure that it's on par to the maximum extent feasible with in-person visitations. Those are the kinds of things we can do to make sure that what many have seen as the silver lining of the pandemic, which is telehealth, becomes much more acceptable into the future. And I think overall, at least from my experience, both healthcare providers and patients, consumers, have accommodated themselves very well to these telehealth models. It's been actually quite positive an experience for each of them.
I know. My doctor actually calls me, which is weird. I'm just like, wow, that's cool. If it could only be that way, maybe it'll stick around. Well, hopefully a lot of what you guys have learned with COVID will help us as we move into the next generation of networks and Internet of Things. I think that we've got some really amazing opportunities in front of us with 5G. And part of that is, you guys working through the interagency process. We have, a restructure on how spectrum is being used, a restructure on a lot of the assets, as well as the capabilities and the challenges with security when it comes to Internet of Things. So how is the 5G process going for our interagency process and you guys working together as we look at our opportunities in front of us?
Sure. I mean, I can take it first, Chris, if that's all right.
Go ahead.
So you can find out more detail about this at the FCC's website, fcc.gov/5G. But in a nutshell, we've been very aggressively executing the FCC's 5G FAST plan. That plan, of course, has three different components. Number one, getting more spectrum into the commercial marketplace, and we're doing that very, very aggressively. We've held several auctions, freeing up thousands of megahertz already. We have an auction starting tomorrow, critical mid-band spectrum in the CBRS or 3.5 gigahertz band. We have another big auction, the C-band auction, starting on December 8th. So we're very aggressively executing on the first part of that. The second part is wireless infrastructure, making sure that we streamline the regulations to make it easier to deploy the small cells and other network architecture of the future. When I came into office, for example, we had something like 60,000 small cells deployed in the country. Last year, I believe we quadrupled that, and we're on a very massive upswing in terms of our trajectory, in terms of future deployment. The final part of it is modernizing our regulations to promote more fiber deployment, fiber being critical for carrying all this internet-connected traffic into the core of the networks, especially with so many millions more, billions more connected devices coming online using 5G. We'll need a lot more fiber. Well, here, we set a record in 2018 for fiber deployment to homes and businesses, a record that was broken in 2019. So we're making a lot of strides there. Even beyond that, we've been working with Chris and with others across the government to promote the other side of the coin in terms of 5G, which is security, making sure that we work across government and with our foreign partners and allies and others to come up to a shared understanding about a risk-based framework for understanding 5G. That strategy, of course, has been bearing a lot of fruit recently, which I'll certainly let Chris take the credit for and talk about. But I think it's very important for all of us to recognize that no one agency, no one person has the entirety of responsibility on this issue. We need to work together, and I'm proud to say that we have done that.
Yeah, so Ajit, thanks. You absolutely set that up the right way. This is an interagency effort, includes Department of Defense, Department of Commerce, and TIA, really working closely over with that team, including Rob Blair, who's moved over from the White House and now leading 5G efforts at Commerce. And pulling together, ultimately you got to sit back and think about what my team's role is. We style ourselves as the nation's risk advisor. And so as a risk management agency, our job is to distill down what the threats, the consequences, the vulnerabilities to get to that risk outcome or that risk factor for any kind of infrastructure. For 5G, we've put a lot of work into this over the last couple of years, and it's funny, I think I've been in this job now for about 3.5 years, and our message has been the same from day one. If we think about the advantages that are going to come with 5G, if we think about the new things that we may not even recognize yet that are going to be enabled by 5G, the real critical aspect when you think about from a cybersecurity side, whether it's a confidentiality attack, an integrity attack, or an availability attack, the thing that we have always been concerned of is less on the confidentiality side. You can encrypt data for those purposes to protect against those attacks. For us, it's more about the availability side. Is the signal there when you need it? Is it performing as you need it? And so for us, it's been a significant focus on how you get trusted vendors into the supply chain, how you get a vibrant global ecosystem that will support a diversity of vendors that are trusted. So that's been a lot of the focus, working with our international partners, primarily not just through the Five Eyes community, so the Brits, the Canadians, the Australians, the New Zealanders, but other partners throughout Europe, India, South Korea, Japan, and elsewhere. And it has been, as I think Ajit just pointed to, it's been successful. It's been slow, no doubt, but there are some meaningful successes over the last several months, and I think probably the most notable development is the recent United Kingdom announcement that they'll phase out Huawei products out of their networks over the course of the next several years. Again, that was not any one single act that led to that. There was a multitude of actions, including some commerce activity on the entities list and just supply chain challenges. So again, it takes a team effort, takes a multitude of levers to get the outcomes that we're looking for. And there's a whole lot of work ahead of us, just to be clear. But we like the trend we're on. And we like the pace of 5G deployments here in the U.S. that Ajit's talked about.
Yeah, thanks for bringing up the UK has been an interesting situation to watch because they seem to have, originally the domestic and it almost seemed like a financial situation when they were going through Brexit. They were like, well, no, we're kind of okay with this Huawei equipment. It's cheaper. It's good. And it was the people in the security community. They're like, well, let's wait, let's take a step back and really think about that. And then this past weekend, we saw a lot of news about them finally making the decision to not bring Huawei equipment into their next network. Is that an ongoing challenge with other in our geopolitical area? I mean, is this something that we'll continue to see, or is the UK kind of finally the pinnacle? People are realizing this is a challenge that we need to understand.
I think it was certainly a significant development in this ongoing effort. And, I work very closely with the National Cybersecurity Center, my counterpart, at least for the next couple of weeks, Kieran Martin. But it is a complicated issue in that it's not, and it never typically is, just a pure security decision process. There are trade equities, there are cost implications, and there are diplomatic implications. So it is a balance that at times has to involve political decision makers. The United States, based on decisions made about 10 years ago, in part by some of Ajit's predecessors, as well as others, the decision for the United States has been very, very clear, again, due to prior actions. But most importantly, I think, is the fact that we have a very long history of malicious or malign activity coming from Chinese cyber actors and some supply chain threats. So for us, it was never really much of a question. Yes, there is some potentially untrustworthy equipment throughout, in part, your rural deployments that I think Ajit probably can talk to a little bit more in depth. But there's a plan for that. Others may not have had those experiences, particularly in places around Europe and Africa and elsewhere. Moreover, they may not be overly concerned about China, saying, hey, little old me. Or if you're a leader of a nation that is looking to give your citizens 5G advantages in a really quick time, if somebody comes in and says, I'll give you a fully integrated 5G tech stack with maintenance at low, no cost, 140% financing, hey, that sounds pretty good to me. I don't have any intelligence you would want anyway, so come on in. Those are the sorts of things that we're trying to overcome. So again, this goes to that all of government solution where it's not just about us saying, hey, don't buy this stuff because it's a risk. You've got to have some sort of alternative. You've got to provide a shoulder to lean on. And I think that's what's really, to me, the most exciting aspect about the next phases in this. In the next panel with Diane Rinaldo and the Open RAN concept, there's just a lot of opportunity, again, to hit to that diverse global market for trusted 5G technologies.
And if I could add just very quickly on top of what Chris's excellent answer, and I won't take it very long, I promise, but there's an interesting and almost symbiotic relationship between what we're doing domestically and what we're doing on the international stage. For example, when I travel abroad, or when I previously traveled abroad and met with some of my foreign counterparts, along with other US government actors, it was very helpful to be able to say, here's what we're doing on 5G, and America is leading the way in terms of the development and deployment of 5G technologies domestically. You can have secured 5G networks while at the same time having advanced 5G networks. There's no dichotomy between security and success in 5G. Conversely, it's very helpful in terms of promoting aggressive 5G action here domestically to be able to say, look, other countries are looking to the US for leadership on these issues. And in particular, there are countries like China and others that want to seize the mantle of 5G leadership. If we don't act quickly domestically, we would ultimately forfeit that American leadership here. That's been helpful domestically in order to be aggressive on some of these issues, when otherwise it might be easy to simply kick the can down the road. So that domestic international linkage is something that's been very challenging, but also productive, I think, in many ways.
All right, so you got the two-finger response, so I'm going to jump in here with one more. Look, and this has kind of been my mantra all along. Why would you give control of the most critical aspect of your critical infrastructure to a country or a company controlled by a country that has demonstrated time and time and time again that they are not to be trusted, that they do not have your best interest in mind? It blows my mind sometimes. I get the cost side of it. I get the trade side of it. But to me, it's just an absolute non-starter to turn over the steering wheel of our most critical infrastructure going forward to someone, again, that does not have our best interests at heart, nor do we share similar values.
Val, great point. Gentlemen, thank you so much for opening up our panel. I think you've given us a lot to discuss on these two topics. And just looking at the chat real quick, the main thing is everybody's saying, great job on the telehealth improvements, and please keep them up. So thank you very much. I really appreciate your time, not only today, but on all the efforts that you're doing and moving forward.
Thanks, Shane.
All of you. Yeah, look forward to the panel.
You're welcome to stick around and ask questions if you wish. All right, we are going to transition over to the panel part of this discussion. So if we can move over to our next group, which is Sujit Raman, who is the Associate Deputy Attorney General at the Department of Justice, Diane Rinaldo, who's the Executive Director of the ORAN Coalition and former Acting Assistant Secretary at NTIA, and Paul Eisler, the Director of Cybersecurity at US Telecom. So do I have a full panel yet? Let me see here. Sujit, I can see you. All right, Diane and Paul, great. All right, guys, I think that was a good way to discuss, start this, but I actually, so those who don't have to watch or figure out our acronym bingo, Diane, can I start with you, and can you explain what ORAN is?
No, absolutely. So Open RAN is the concept of standardizing the interfaces between the components from the radio access network. The idea is that if you're able to standardize the interfaces, you'd be able to plug and play the components. So you wouldn't have to, so a carrier wouldn't have to purchase an entire network. They could choose to interchange the components. It would allow for better optimization for the different areas, whether you're in an urban area or in a rural area. You can start to build out a network that best suits your needs. As we discuss the policymakers' biggest concern, if not them, then who? This has really gained steam as Dish has recently announced that they're using Open RAN standards to build out their nationwide network, as well as other work occurring around the world with Rakuten, Reliance Jio in India. So it again is a kind of a private sector market-based approach on how we move forward on these important questions and concerns.
Great. And Sujit, bringing you in on that, because it seems like trust in the network is a theme we were hearing about just previously with Director Krebs, is how do we make sure that as we build this new network, we trust our partners, which is part of what Diane's challenge is. But what is the Department of Justice interest in this? You are on mute. There we go. We can hear you now.
Well, thank you, Shane, for the invitation to join. The Department of Justice has a lot of interests. There's the security side of it. Just yesterday, as you probably saw, we announced an indictment against 2 Chinese individuals who have essentially worked with the Chinese state to engage in IP theft and widespread sort of malign cyber activity. So we have the defensive side, which is to ensure that where individuals are using U.S. networks to commit crime, that we're monitoring that, investigating it, prosecuting it. There's also a broader sort of national security policy issue as well. And I think Chairman Pai and Director Krebs stated it exactly right. Why would you ever put your critical infrastructure in the hands of a potentially hostile foreign adversary? So from a foreign intelligence point of view, we also have a very significant interest. So there's a law enforcement interest, there's a foreign intelligence interest, and there's also just a very basic kind of rule of law interest, which is, again, we want to make sure that our company's IP is protected, that it's not being stolen, that our communications are secure, and that our the bloodlines of the country, the critical infrastructure is protected and kept safe. So that's ultimately the law enforcement interest in all of this.
And Paul, as we're talking about this, kind of go to the basics of, we've got hardware, cables, switches, we have cloud computing going on. So there are some things that are similar to our current system, and then a lot of things that we are transitioning to a brand new system. How is that going? As I know you're spending a lot of time in the standards bodies and an international perspective.
Right. So, I mean, what we really need to do is move towards a competitive global ecosystem where we have diversity of trusted suppliers. And that's what ORAN's helping us doing. We're moving towards an environment where the networks can be deployed without being dependent on a single vendor. And this is really important because ORAN's going to help the United States supply chain become more secure, because it's going to increase supplier diversity, it's going to increase market competition, it's going to increase opportunities for businesses to innovate. And this is going to both increase the economic and the national security interests of the United States. So that's why we're really committed to seeing this path forward. And we're glad to have our government partners helping us through this process, because as we're starting to see the funding of research and development, we hope that this is just a first step towards a more robust engagement in the near future. And specifically when it comes to international standards development, this is an area across multiple technologies, and we're going to talk about IoT, but specific ORAN, IoT in many different areas. It's really important for the United States to take leadership.
Well, and this is sort of a unique cross-bred topic for technology, because I always think the zeros and ones, they don't really have a conscience. But as one of my think tank colleagues, Doug Brake at ITIF, said, their international security issues around 5G is about fundamental values. So you all have brought in some interesting perspective here, that while we're looking at it very much just changing over our network, relationships and technology, how are we building the value and the trust into the network? I'm an open question to all of you. And a stunner, apparently.
I can just speak to some of the cybersecurity benefits here. Is that as we move to Open RAN, it's going to allow, from a network's operation perspective, it's going to allow the operators to more quickly react to replace or address different kinds of suspect equipment when those concerns arise. And we're also going to have more intelligent management. So we're going to be able to better shift network capacity around to meet different levels of demand. So for example, in the recent pandemic, I know that different levels of demand at different periods were a real concern. We want to make sure that networks can meet them. Now, we did meet them. We were really successful in that, but it never hurts to become even better. And that's why with intelligent management that's going to be enabled by ORAN, we're going to have a type of open architecture that really just allows the operators a greater set of options in addressing the different kinds of problems that can arise.
So the idea that vendors are building to a spec, and there's an understanding on those standards, and I guess part of the challenge is making sure that we have enough people that can build to those standards. So Diane, how many people do you have currently in your, do we call it a coalition, a collaboration? What is our ORAN group
coalition
called?
We are officially the Open RAN Policy Coalition.
Right.
So we are up to 51 members. We span the entire mobile ecosystem, everyone from the carriers to the network equipment guys to edge. I think it's the breadth of the coalition and the amount of different companies that have come forward and want to participate in this really show the need for that everyone wants to move together on 5G issues and move forward. As I'm sure you can all appreciate, getting 51 companies to agree on anything is tough. So we've made a decision that we're going to stay high level. We're going to educate policymakers, think tanks, academics, others about the benefits of Open RAN, what is happening in this space, and how it is helping with the evolution of 5G and beyond.
And I'm getting a question here. Paul, if you can elaborate on the Internet of Things public-private partnership, including the NIST framework. And we've got, I guess, CTA and C2 that are engaged in that.
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, standards development is really important, because, and especially in the IoT space where you have different governments in different parts of the world, well-intentioned, but they're creating different types of requirements, assessment structures, labeling programs related to IoT. So what this does, it risks fragmenting this global ecosystem into multiple regional standards, and we really need to avoid that. What we need is an international answer as best as possible to answer questions of how to design and build IoT products. Because let's say you're building a new product, I mean, your engineers are going to need to know what are the specifications that they need to build to in order to ensure this product can be deployed without problems, whether it's in the United States, in Europe, in Asia, in Latin America, Africa, in countries all over the world. You're going to need answers that the engineers are going to have to build to the different specifications that are required. And we're hoping that if we can get to a place where that's harmonized, or at least if there's mutual recognition, then what we can do is we can preserve the economies of scale, we can remove trade barriers, we can create, like I said, legal and the policy harmonization or the mutual recognition. And what we can do is we can just increase the deployment of secure products. Because one of the major security concerns is that you're not currently always able to 100% of the time to be sure whether somebody is building to the sorts of security requirements that you want, because we need to start speaking a more common, unified language. So when you talk about what the efforts that have been going on, I mean, I trace them back to 2018, when US Telecom founded the Council to Secure the Digital Economy. And this is a partnership of 13 global ICT companies, which are dedicated to cyber and economic security, which we co-manage together with the Consumer Technology Association. So our inaugural publication, which today we call it the International Botnet and IoT Security Guide, this was recognized by the Global Internet Governance Forum, BPF on Cybersecurity, among the world's landmark cybersecurity agreements. And in 2019, we took this a step further. We recognized that what we needed was an IoT baseline. We wanted an answer to the question of what are the baseline capabilities an IoT device should have. So that's how the C2 project, as we call it, was born. And what that was, we convened 20 major standards bodies, technical alliances, civil society groups, to develop the C2 consensus on IoT security. In doing so, we leveraged the expertise of hundreds of technical professionals. And in addition to the 20 groups that formally participated, there were a number of organizations that participated informally, because we really wanted to make sure that we understand the different layers of complexity. Because when you're building a baseline that's going to apply across the ecosystem, you want to understand the nuance, you want to understand that different industries have different needs. And we really wanted to build that industry-wide consensus. And I have to say, I mean, we've had remarkable feedback in the year since the consensus was published. For example, APEC organizers, they recently hosted a talk on the consensus at an IoT security conference in Malaysia. Directly to your question, we have a really close working partnership with NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Their recently published core baseline for IoT, it reflects the real spirit of public-private partnership and collaboration, and they've been integral to our efforts internationally. To address the standards issue specifically, where NIST is playing a pivotal role together with the industry consensus, we are working together with the Cybersecurity Specialist Committee over at ISO IEC. So they recently completed work on the first working draft for an international technical standard, which is, as I mentioned, that's where we need to get eventually. So this is, for anyone who wants to look it up, it's draft 27402. And we've also have a technical standard that maps one-to-one with each specific capability that industry put together in the C2 consensus led by the Council to Secure the Digital Economy with the 20 organizations. And that's going to be CTA 2088. And if I can just, I know I'm going on here, but let me just add one more thing, is that this year we're producing a supplement to the C2 consensus. And what this supplement does, it not only reaffirms the 2019 guidance about, it's also showing in detail how our work is driving changes and bringing the world ever closer to the international consensus. It's showing that there's real strength in the collaborative approach where you bring everyone together, you bring the stakeholders from the standards bodies and civil society and industry, you work together with the government partners, and I really, I am confident that this work product is going to show then an international solution, an international answer to the IoT standardization issue, it really is a plausible reality that we're going to have in the near future, I believe.
I love seeing someone get so excited and enthusiastic about standards. Thank you. Hey, so
That's impressive, Paul.
when I hear all this, and somebody's has been spending a lot of time in cybersecurity, and Director Krebs kind of talked about this, and we have a lot of crime going on the internet as it stands now, and now we're talking about putting this exponential and everything being connected and all these devices being connected. How do you guys capture all that? I mean, it's the challenge is it's like you're unlike a physical crime where you can kind of map it out. I mean, can you see that with what's going on, and how do you guys manage those challenges?
So that's a great question, Shane, and that is really one of our biggest concerns right now is in a 5G environment where so much of the data is distributed to the edge. You don't have a kind of centralized area where you can process, or you can serve, say, wiretap orders. How do you make sure that we're appropriately gathering evidence? We do live in a rule of law society. Everything that we do at the Department of Justice through the FBI or the DEA or other investigative agencies is bound by law. The corollary of that is when you follow the law, you should be able to gain access to the evidence. And one of our concerns is that as time goes on, we might lose some of those capabilities. And so we're working very actively in the standard bodies and also with the private sector to make sure that all of the various legal requirements that exist don't suddenly disappear. Now, to be sure, we've dealt with this in the past, right? There have been advances in telecommunications infrastructure in the past, and we've been able to sort of keep up with that. 5G is essentially that situation on steroids. And so we're acting very, very proactively in the law enforcement community to work with the private industry to make sure that, we're keeping our communications safe, but we're also ensuring that there's access as appropriate and as necessary when authorized by a court of law. But I think that is, from a law enforcement perspective, one of the very big questions. How do you keep the right guys in? How do you keep the wrong guys out? So I think you've put your finger right on it.
Well, and we love the open architecture of the internet. It's what it's allowed us to all be connected throughout the globe. It does give us a bit of an opportunity to add a layer of security, which didn't exist in the original architecture. And Vint Cerf's very open about that. He's like, we all know each other. It wasn't something that we were planning on. So it sounds like one of the things that you all are working on is some level of consensus to make sure that we're building all the right levers into this next generation network. Diane and Paul, is that something that you can kind of elaborate on? What is the core baseline?
Sure. And I think, in my humble opinion, the move to 5G is the biggest one that we will see since moving to 3G, where we had the mobile internet. But this time we have lessons learned. We are starting with cybersecurity. We are, as they say, right, baking it in as opposed to bolting on. And I think that over the past several years, industry has come together. Chris Krebs' organization at CISA has lent an opportunity to bring people together to create a public-private partnership so they can exchange information. They're making sure that not only can threats be exchanged, but best practices and lessons learned. Understanding these people are partners, they're competitors, but also understanding that everyone is in this together, and that the greater success of the networks and keeping everyone's businesses up and running is tantamount. So, I think as we move to 5G, we've had a tremendous benefit from these conversations starting 8 years ago after kind of we went through the 4G process. So, I think anything that the government can do to continue to encourage, and I know Sujit, as the top cyber guy at DOJ, we've had coffee before and had these conversations. It's important to ensure that people continue to come to the table to exchange best practices and ideas, and it only helps move the ball further down the court.
How close are we to all these magical things we keep hearing about? Zero latency, all this, cars talking to cars. Pretty much all my devices are just going to run my life for me. I'm really looking forward to that.
I can't wait for that autonomous vehicle to take me from DC to Annapolis, so I don't have to do the hour commute anymore. So I would say that, again, this is, back when we were going through 4G, it was more of I always say the old Kevin Costner baseball movie, if you build it, they will come. Now that we move into 5G, we really have that demand side pushing down on us, where we were talking about industrial floors and autonomous vehicles. that, if we only have, low latency, increased powers, taking that 2-lane highway, blowing it out to 100 lanes, they would be able to get all these connections online. So I think that we're close. We're close to making a lot of these things a reality. I remember when I worked for Mike Rogers all those years ago, going to Silicon Valley and sitting down with Mark Andreessen and him telling us about how drones is going to deliver mail. And I walked out of there and I'm like, that's ridiculous. Well, you know what? That's why they're billionaires and I'm not. So, there
like
are a lot of
mail that you speak of, right?
I know. So there are a lot of smart people that have been thinking about this for a long time. So,
Shane, I do think that is, just sitting where I sit, that is one of the really tough questions here is timing. Diane and Paul have both spoken very eloquently, I think, about the ORAN concept. I think one of the challenges in that same vein is, what is the time frame here? Because obviously Chinese companies, Huawei is not part of the ORAN alliance, and it shouldn't be. But that's the flip side of it, right? Is that they're not focused on interoperability. They're out there trying to sell their products today, and they're very aggressive about it. And they've got a very powerful national government supporting them with all the associated subsidies. So I think that is one of the challenges for us here in the free world is how do we build that interoperable system, but do it on a time frame that actually keeps us competitive with respect to a global behemoth that really doesn't play by the rules that many of our companies play by. So I guess that would be a question for some of my other panelists, because I am genuinely interested in their thinking on that issue.
So I can respond to that in terms of the IoT work that's been going on. Our approach has not been to try to boil the ocean. The whole idea of a core baseline is we want to focus on the sorts of capabilities that we already know. These are the right solutions, and no matter where you are in the world, the technology for IoT, that's what needs to drive the policy. So whether you have people speaking different languages or you have different interpretations of the same sets of instructions, our goal is if an engineer looks at, let's say, the NIST guidance for core IoT baseline, or whether they look at an industry-produced guidance, which is a little bit more detail-oriented, or whether they're ultimately eventually looking at an international standard, we want the engineers to be ultimately doing the same thing. We want them to be taking the steps that they need in order to secure the ecosystem. So, and a lot of this is stuff that we already know needs to be done. Like, for example, I'm going to talk about context IoT. We know it's important to identify devices. We know secure access is important. We know it's important to protect data, whether it's at rest, whether it's in transit, to validate data. We need event logging, cryptography, patching. Like, these are not things that we don't know we need. This is just a way of developing a common language and a consensus where we bring government together, we bring industry together, we bring civil society to the table. We make sure that we're all speaking that unified voice. And I believe that once you get to that point where you have that widespread agreement that you need, then it's going to be really difficult for someone to challenge that kind of strong, technically sound, scientifically guided consensus.
Well, while we have you on screen here, can you give us a baby tutorial on how we're going to network virtualization with software-defined networking? Because that seems to be the major change when we talk about the challenge of Huawei, is that we will eventually be able to migrate away from hardware making some major decisions because software will now be more in charge of the system, especially with cloud. So if you could elaborate on that for us.
Sure. So there is, there's an ongoing move towards software-defined networking and network function virtualization, which take advantage of the open standardized interfaces of ORAN. Now, these are not necessarily the same thing. So like ORAN is not the same as vRAN, and you might have different folks feeling differently about how these technologies get implemented. But the important thing is that when you have an open standardized interface, you have more choices. You can have a network that mixes different technologies, different capabilities from different vendors. You could have one that's partly software defined. You could have one that ultimately you could get to the point where everything is software. We have different paths open towards the future. And what you really need to do is make sure that no matter which model you pick, you have that openness, you have the opportunity for businesses to innovate. Because right now, the challenge that we're addressing most fundamentally is that regardless of which strategy you're picking, you're dealing with a very limited set of suppliers. And that gets even more complicated when you throw in the policy, the geopolitics, all the different concerns that we're all dealing with all the time. So if we can just make sure that we agree on standardization of interoperable interfaces, I think there's going to be different strategies, and you're going to see which ones work and which ones don't.
Yeah, we'd like to keep the stuff that works.
And if I could just quickly add, at the coalition, we're not seeking mandates. We believe that there's a demand side for Open RAND, and Open RAND's not a technology; it's an architecture. It's standardizing the interfaces so you can plug and play the components. So when you do that, you're allowing for additional competition, which is going to drive innovation in that space. I mean, as we've seen up to this point, there's been very little VC money into the telecom network space because there's such a lack of diversity, and it's hard to inject new players. And when you do that, you're going to drive down prices. So I know when I was at NTIA traveling around the world, it's different internationally. We have a light touch regulatory system in the US. International space, they're heavily regulated, and making decisions about who they're going to use in their networks could mean the difference between being in the red and being in the black. So what we're talking about the coalition is increasing choice, giving people choices. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Thanks. No, that's very helpful. I'm actually, I've got somebody who's moderating the chat for me, and I have two going on here. And so some of this, again, this is the Internet Governance Forum. So we have people from, not only that are technical, but people in civil society and private, private citizens. So there's some questions about kind of getting to the privacy aspects, which there seems to be kind of a pro and a con, as well as, this is a question specifically for you, Sujit, on what are the digital forensic standards being used, and are there continued challenges? Does this help you keep evidence to prosecute as you're dealing with challenges with chain of custody? Very specific question there.
Yeah, it is a good question and a pretty technical question, which I don't know the direct answer to. I can tell you at least today, we're able to continue our digital evidence gathering in the way that we've traditionally done it. I think the big challenge is as 5G sort of gets increasingly deployed across the country, what is the impact going to be on, let's say, when you serve a subpoena, or you serve a search warrant, or you serve a wiretap order, where physically is that going to happen? Because right now, you just send the wiretap order to Verizon, T-Mobile, whoever. They've got a centralized server, they serve it, they create an interface, and they produce the data. If there isn't that centralized architecture going forward, there's an actual engineering question, right? Is how do you actually make that happen? And I know that's something our colleagues in law enforcement, in the investigative agencies, are working on as we speak with all the major U.S. telecoms.
Thanks. That's actually a really interesting question, because it's ethereal, like where exactly is this happening, and who where do you put the nexus point? A question for you, Paul, is what should we be focused on with the threat landscape, and are we putting things into the process to make sure we can mitigate risk?
So I mean, the threat landscape is pretty broad depending on what you're talking about, but I think that it's important to have a healthy balance of risk management together with incident response. So for example, the Council to Secure the Digital Economy, in addition to its work on an ecosystem-wide guide to combating botnets and its work on IoT security, it also came out with a guide to responding to the more serious cyber incidents that are plausible. So for example, it's called the Cyber Crisis Guide. You can find it at securingdigitaleconomy.com. And what it does is it shows what are the touch points at which industry and government can work together, and who are the relevant stakeholders to respond to different incidents. Now, in terms of how you can just secure yourself on a more practical level in terms of IoT, I mean, there's very comprehensive guidance that NIST put out on that. The exact NISTer the number's escaping my mind right now, but if you just search for NIST, IoT security, you look at the publication they put out, it's really, really comprehensive. And just on a practical level, you have to be aware of how much in your home is connected. You have a lot of different situations where people don't even realize that something as simple as like a children's toy can connect to the internet. And I'll just give you one anecdote of something that really always surprises me when I think of how something that you'd never think will cause a security vulnerability ends up causing one. there was a casino that had its high roller database stored in its, in its network. And this casino happened to have an aquarium. The aquarium happened to have a thermostat. Somebody, some ingenious criminal, really, they figured out a way to slowly transfer data through the thermostat. They stole the high roller database. And this is something that's really invaluable to business. And you just never think that something like this would happen. So again, this is one anecdote. There's a million different ways, but you have to really think that anything as whether it's a thermostat or a children's toy or a dog collar or sports equipment, or whether it's an industrial control system, everything needs to have an appropriate level of security.
I remember that story being published a couple of years ago. It was fascinating, which does make you wonder, like, when you're holding a device, like, does this really need to be connected to the internet? And I say that as somebody who now has both Alexa and Hey Google and Siri as a daily criteria in my life. It's like they're all talking to me now. A question for you, Diane, that's in the chat is to sort of explain. There's somebody saying that they want to. They're actually chatting back and forth about how Chinese companies are part of the ORAN alliance. It's kind of a point of clarification that that this is not somebody. You're being inclusive, not disclusive,
sure.
I guess.
So I'm actually the Open RAN Policy Coalition. My coalition focuses on policy and working with policymakers domestically and internationally. The ORAN Alliance is focused on standards work. So yes, the Alliance does have a couple of Chinese members. Huawei is not a participant of the ORAN Alliance, but
yeah, that's actually a great point to make.
Happens all the time. The confusion happens all the time.
There's a whole discussion going on over here about privacy and what is the challenge with the GDPR coming in, and how we've seen information like things like the Who Is, for those of us who are really geeks in this space, for ICANN has now closed information on who is registering domain names and some of the nefarious activity that they're doing online. I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that. I know that's a challenge, and with CCPA, we're seeing even less clarity about how we are able to track some of the information of what's going on online and people that are using the internet for bad things.
Well, I can handle that just very quickly, Shane. The day GDPR came into effect, I gave a speech at CSIS talking about how there's going to be tremendous implications for us on the Who Is front. And pretty much everything I said has come true, right? It is increasingly difficult for us to just get very basic information about who's behind a particular IP address. And to suggest that, the GDPR somehow bars that information or protects that information is a pretty strained reading, frankly, of the GDPR. And yet here we are, right? We're in a situation now where law enforcement has a very difficult time getting access. And we've at least got relationships with foreign law enforcement, folks, where we can at least try to work around. I can't even imagine what it's like for an independent, patent holder or a person who's trying to protect their civil rights, IP rights. So it's a real problem. It's something that we have obviously made very, very clear at the very highest levels in the U.S. government to our friends in the EU. There's a lot of activity on the Hill in sort of talking to members of Congress about this. What's the solution? I don't know. We need to keep the pressure up. And recent decisions like, Schrems 2 don't help, because it creates this sort of sense that, the European privacy regime is sort of extraterritorially applying itself around the world. And it's very different than the system we have here in the US, which, to be sure, our privacy regime can be improved. There's probably a need for a national privacy law, but one that doesn't fetishize sort of the European concept of privacy above every other value, which unfortunately is now kind of what we're seeing. So the Who Is problem is one that impacts us every single day. And I say, in law enforcement, again, we've at least got some ways to work around that, though it's still very difficult for us. I can't imagine what it's like for people who don't have those, relationships or those authorities.
Yeah, it seems to be a constant challenge. Actually, now we've got a whole group going on here that just says that we need, they're looking for congressional help on that. So that looks like that'll be interesting. So we're getting to the top of the hour. Do we have kind of like a lightning round? Any last comments that people want to make that they haven't had a chance to talk about yet? We covered it all? Okay.
Been a great discussion.
Yeah, it's really been, I think, helpful. There's so many threads to this. There's the international, policy discussion, as well as the technical, the standards. It's all the way down to the very basic domestic, talking to city councils and understanding what this is as we're trying to put all this equipment in place. One thing that we didn't discuss today that got, just touched on early with the chairman and the director is that there's a lot of investment that needs to be made in this space. So that's one of the reasons why these policy discussions happening ahead of time is so vital, is making sure that there's the interest of putting the money towards it so we can see the build out of 5G and all these things that have been promised to us. So I want to thank everybody. I was just told we have another half an hour for questions. Sorry. So apologies. I've got a couple people moderating my questions here, except for I'm waiting for the download on my wonderful device. The fun of virtual. How, from the actual locality, are you guys spending much time with the cities and counties? I know that smart cities was something that we actually highlighted on last year's 5G panel. Are we seeing progress in that area? Yes. Anybody I know Las Vegas, besides having aquariums that were able to be taken over by devices, has used a lot of this to make sure that this is pre-COVID, where they would have idling of cars, they would actually change out the lights as part of their smart city process to make sure that they were actually working on their EPA standards. So I know that we've seen some states be really innovative in this area. I just don't know if we're seeing them actually come to the table when it comes to the standards and some of the challenges that you guys have.
So I can say in terms of the standards, our efforts have been focused more on the national and international levels and the regional levels. So we haven't really gone as granular as specific states, but insofar that some states have passed specific laws related to IoT, now that you have this growing consensus, this is an opportunity to ensure that whatever legislation comes out, whichever level it's at, that it's in harmony with what the industry consensus and our collaborative consensus internationally, that we end up in the same place. Because the last thing you would want is fragmentation, which we normally worry about that at the international or regional scale, at these bigger levels. But it is possible to fragment domestically as well, which would complicate any of the very positive efforts and movement that we've had in recent months and years.
I know that, again, this is kind of 2019 discussion, feel like this fell off the table, is the challenge with rip and replace when it came to Huawei equipment. I don't know where we kind of ended with that. I know there was a congressional discussion about whether we were going to be doing some funding. Does anybody know where that stands?
The SEC recently had a filing in which our organization filed comments, and they're currently discussing the amount of funding in the moving pieces of legislation. So it seems like it is gaining steam, and they possibly should have something within the next several months to move that forward.
And then kind of as a lead on, and Diane, this is kind of tapping into your old role over on cybersecurity, is, question is, should Congress establish a cybersecurity standard as it goes towards, 5G?
So, it's hard. Do you want Congress deciding standards? I think that there's always, again, kind of going back to the public-private partnerships on how we move forward on these things. As a former congressional staffer, I can assure you, you didn't want me to tell you how to run your networks. That would not work out well for any of us. But again, you want to create an atmosphere where companies can come to the table and have frank conversations with the government, and that's happening at CISA under Director Krebs and with DOJ. You want to ensure that information can flow in both directions, and that, again, there's an understanding that we're all in this together in pushing that ball uphill.
Putting standards in place is always the challenge. Is then you're just stuck.
Right. It's hard to move anything in Congress, as everyone knows.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. Sorry, I'm waiting for the questions to populate here. There was a comment which I thought was sort of interesting on IoT. Oh, where did these things pop on the screen and they go? That microcontrollers were by far the most important thing in IoT, which is something I didn't know. I don't know if you concur with that, Paul, but somebody in our chat thinks that's very important.
Well, I think every industry will rate their product as the most important, but our job is to secure all of them. So
we have a whole group of people over here now debating whether or not we need government intervention on privacy. So we have not left that discussion over here in the chat. So you guys know that. So we talked a little bit in the opening with the chairman and the director about what's going on with the UK and Huawei. How are we looking from an international perspective on that, that discussion? It feels for some people like it's just too China centric. I think that, it's going back to that trust question we talked about earlier. Are we seeing that other countries are starting to realize that there's, that the dialogue needs to continue about who are our trusted partners on an international level? I know the ITU has been challenged with their meetings. They've been pushing some of them back. Are we seeing that the dialogue continue as things go virtual?
Absolutely. I think with the United States participated in the Prague proposals last year and continues to have good conversations with our allies in Europe and around the world. And again, right, it's discussions around trusted vendors, vendor lock-in. Do you want a closed proprietary system that you're stuck with and costs, incredibly large sums of money when you do get around to wanting to replace it? There's such enticing deals with certain companies offering, 20-year interest-free, and you don't have to pay the first 3 years, right? Well, as my mom used to tell me, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. So it's important to continue to have conversations with our allies around the world. And again, from the Open RAN Policy Coalition standpoint, it's about getting more choices out there so people can make not only informed decisions, but have a good, solid list of companies they can choose from.
I think the Digital Belt and Road program, which Director Krebs kind of alluded to, is definitely a challenge for some areas, like let's say, some of the countries in Africa. They're like, we don't have a lot in our network already to steal, so we're okay with going with the lower cost, which is still high quality, which is part of, I realize that the opportunities that your members of the ORAN coalition are looking at is, making sure that we can see that quality at another level. And then with the idea that for a long time we had the Nokia and Ericsson seem to be the ones that are winning here. Are we seeing more of the component parts that are possibly coming in from other countries other than our Nordic friends and the Chinese?
Yeah, all boats rise, right? Nokia is a member of our coalition. We've done a lot of good work with Ericsson as well. So I think that as these conversations continue to happen, all of these companies are seeing additional business, and they produce a great product. And so that's what people want, right? They want a great product. They want to know it's safe. And they want to know that there's going to be the ability for it to be serviced throughout the life of their network.
I have to include Samsung on that. Samsung's doing a great
job. Yes, Samsung, thank you. Yes, Samsung's also a member of our coalition as well.
Going actually more to a state thing, there's some questions here about, are there specific states that are passing IoT security laws? One of them they think is specifically in California. Are there challenges with this on privacy and IoT in the states that we should be paying attention to? So
in terms of the risk of fragmentation, California, I believe there's Ohio. So we have seen some states, not too many, thankfully, that have taken some initiatives, but now that there's a different level of maturity, now that we already have the first draft of an international standard, now that we already have a US standard, I think the conversation's advanced to a point where this really has to be taken care of at a higher level. Because as we're trying to build bridges with other countries, as we're trying to get them to meet us where we need to be in terms of security, we can't really afford to be arguing against ourselves. So part of coalition building is harmonizing different points of view. And while I do think that there's good intentions and that a lot of the people putting forth these bills just really want to get to the security in a way that that makes sense for everyone, when you look at how that can actually frustrate the very goals they're trying to advance, I would say that state level fragmentation can actually be quite detrimental. In terms of the privacy, what we've done for the IoT C2 consensus effort led by the Council to Secure the Digital Economy, what we really decided to do is say, okay, the device should be secure so that you can implement privacy as a policy decision. But because we want to allow ourselves flexibility as we negotiate these things on the world stage, we didn't actually get everybody to say this is the exact privacy policy, because we felt that we really just wanted the engineers to focus on the science. We wanted them to just be wearing their science hats and not their policy hats.
Is there a time frame for the ISO standard?
So I can't promise a specific time frame, but what I can say is that there's already a first draft out, and that means that this is a serious effort. And if you want something in the meantime, you have CTA 2088, and that one is available this year, and that one is already it maps one-to-one with the industry consensus. So it's no longer a guessing game in terms of, well, okay, you've laid out that this is a capability that an IoT device needs in order to secure itself. How does an engineer actually implement that? Well, the guidance is now available. So
a lead on, or after a question that is, they're asking, is there any low-hanging fruit we can accomplish on the way to an ISO?
So I wouldn't characterize the effort that we've undertaken as low-hanging fruit, because it was actually a lot of work. But it's something that right now, with the guidance that's available, which is based on this effort that, like I said, 20 different organizations, standards bodies, civil society, industry coming together, the guidance is now mature and sophisticated enough that an engineer can know what to do. And that's the important part we've been getting to. Now, again, we do want to get to that international standard, and that's very important for all the reasons we went into. But in the meantime, it's important that engineers have those instructions in front of them, and we've made sure that they have that.
Thank you. Let's see, there's a comment. David McGarrett says that the government needs to create a citizen protection agency for the online world, and I think that everybody should get superhero costumes if we do that. Two other questions, and this is a kind of a broad one, but how are we protecting America's companies against international cyber threats?
Well, I could take a shot at that, Shane. I mean, that's obviously one of our primary mission at the Department of Justice, is keeping America safe when it comes to cyber threats. Look, a lot of it is, ensuring that the private sector sort of is understanding what's going on, sort of making sure that people are aware of the threat, because so much of our nation's infrastructure is in the hands of the private sector. So it really is up to the private sector to make sure that it's engaging in best practices, it knows what's going on. And part of our job, when we, at least on the law enforcement side, and of course there's a critical role that our colleagues at DHS play when it comes to resilience, when there is a cyber attack, making sure that the victim is sort of back on their feet, able to operate again. Our job on the law enforcement side is to figure out who did it. And so attribution is a major part of cyber deterrence, because the only way you can call out, bad actors for doing what they did is if you actually know who it is. And so that's been one of our primary focuses, is improving our attribution tools, working with the intelligence community as appropriate, where sources and methods aren't exposed, to bring indictments, to make sure the public is aware of what particularly adverse nation states are up to, what their methods are, because often, if you're a general counsel of a large company and you read one of these indictments, you realize, oh my gosh, I've got vulnerabilities here, here, and here. I need to make sure I start working on that with my team. So, a major part of our goal is to actually put hands on people who do bad things and hold them accountable in U.S. court. But I would say an increasingly important part of what we do, at least when it comes to indictments, is just making sure that people understand what adversary nation states and individuals are really up to. And that's something we've really tried to step up in the last three to 4 years, are these indictments. The traditional criticism or complaint was, you indict these guys and you're never going to get your hands on them. What's the point? I think there is first of all, we do get our hands on some of these guys. In fact, in a number of cyber criminal cases, we've extradited folks from third-party countries. Not everybody wants to hang out in Russia all day. The winters are rough. You end up in Greece or in other parts of the world, and all of a sudden, extradition treaties come into play. But more to the point, it's raising awareness, and the sophistication of some of these players is obviously very, very high. And to the extent we can disclose what they're up to through these criminal indictments, we try to do so. So I think awareness is a major part of it.
So can you talk about yesterday's indictments with the Chinese two people who were apparently stealing, were looking to appropriate information on COVID, but had apparently been doing this for about 10 years?
About 10 years. Yeah, I mean, obviously I can't say much more than what's in the indictment, but I think the indictment is quite detailed in laying out how these two particular individuals had been essentially engaging in, computer intrusions on a number of sensitive U.S. companies, as well as human rights activists. They were essentially rented out as organs of the Chinese intelligence apparatus. And that's a little bit unique. We've brought cases in the past where we've shown the link between the criminal underworld and, say, the Russian intelligence services. But this is the first indictment that we've publicly released involving essentially, freelancers, folks who were engaging in cyber criminality on the side, making a fair amount of money doing it, but also, when necessary, being hired by the Chinese intelligence services. The underlying point here is that it has been going on for a very long time, and despite all of its public protests, protestations of complying with global cyber norms, the Chinese state has not been. And I think as part of this broader discussion that we're having about 5G generally, trust is the ultimate question. And why should we ever trust a nation state that uses criminality as an organ of geopolitical advantage, right? You're pretty much in that rogues gallery when you start doing that. And I think it's very, very important for all of us on this conversation to recognize that. And, look, I'd say 3-4 years ago, it was hard to bring the national security discussion into discussions like this, where so much of the focus tended to be on just the commercial side or the technical side. I think it is beyond dispute now that national security is at the very top of the discussion points when it comes to issues like 5G rollout. And that's a positive thing, right? It's critically important that all of us who are dealing with these issues keep the national security equities foremost in mind. So I think that's a positive development.
You bring up an ongoing challenge where once a crime's been committed, people tend to like to look at the forensic evidence and see if they can keep that from happening a second time or again and again. But the information sharing has always been a challenge when it came to the IT area, especially across the government barrier. So you had the information flowing between the corporations and I realize it's more a question really for DHS, but does that seem to be better? Are we sharing more information amongst the government agencies and the private community on how they can secure?
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes. I think within the government, we have certainly, particularly since 2016, really built the relationships within the government to share, particularly when it comes to foreign state actors. And so we, at DOJ and FBI are very closely aligned, obviously, with the intelligence community. The FBI is part of the intelligence community. And so when we talk about, foreign influence issues, and I know there was some discussion of that with Chairman Pai and Director Krebs, when it comes to foreign disinformation, I feel very confident that our intelligence community is monitoring it, sees it, knows what's going on. And within the government, within all the key departments that deal with these issues, DOJ, DHS, Commerce Department, State Department, Treasury to some extent, we're all quite well aligned on that issue. With the private sector, that's also been one of our, real priorities. And I'm so happy to see that my colleagues at the NSA have stood up their cybersecurity directorate in the last few months, actively engaging with the private sector to make sure that there is that interface. As I said, so much of this country's critical infrastructure, digital infrastructure, is in the hands of the private sector. So there are a number of initiatives we've taken, not only within DOJ, but also across the government, to build that relationship with the private sector. So I think, if you compare us today to, say, 4 years ago, we are much better postured. And particularly with the social media companies, that is one area where we've tried to aggressively declassify information as needed. Again, build a relationship so that there's not a lag. There's always going to be limitations on what we in the government can share, particularly information we derive through criminal process, right? Because that's protected by the federal grand jury rules, and those are extremely significant and important privacy rules. But to the extent that when it comes to classified information, we can find ways to share with the public, with the private sector, we've been doing that. So, again, there's always room for improvement, but I think we're better postured today, certainly, than we've been ever before.
And Director,
from a private sector perspective, add to that, like, absolutely. I mean, the level of collaboration with our government partners is always improving. I will say one of the things we really appreciated from a communication sector perspective. So now I'm talking beyond just my employer, U.S. Telecom, but we chaired the Communication Sector Coordinating Council. And one of the things we're looking at is when the Cyberspace Solarium Commission published its report, one of their recommendations was to review and update intelligence authorities to actually increase intelligence support to the broader private sector. So we thought that this was a very important initiative. It was bipartisan. It came from industry and government support behind it. So as legislation moves forward that tries to implement that recommendation, we think that that's really important.
Well, and Director Krebs mentioned, and this tends to be for actually smaller businesses and individuals that it's a challenge, is that we've seen a huge uptick in spam as well as spear phishing and ransomware during COVID, which is, you know, you've got a small business and they lock up their data. It becomes very easy for them to think, I just go spend $2,000 or $15,000 in crypto and hopefully get all my information back. So hearing people like to hear from their government and know, kind of how to manage through this. So thank you. That's all great comments. Here's another question actually on cybersecurity and IoT. Does the ability with 5G help with, it seems like, there'll be more vulnerabilities and remedies in this question, but the question of being able to geofence or geolocate with the 5G, being able to be closer in proximity, and does that help actually create a geo barrier when it comes to securing IoT? Does that make sense? Am I asking? I don't know if I'm asking this question right, but what comes to mind is, let's say, like a warehouse, where you might be able to take your system and keep them all the information going on. And I'm also thinking, as I'm saying that out loud, that might not be necessarily a 5G, but it might be a Bluetooth or some other kind of technology that you're using there. But the idea that you might be able to circumvent your security because of a geolocation issue with 5G or IoT, I mean.
So what I will say that with 5G deployment, and especially as you move towards Open RAN, whatever security considerations there might be, and I would have to do some research to answer that specific one, but those are vastly offset by the newfound ability to move from being proactive to being active solution finders, because you're just going to have more choices. You're going to have intelligent management. You're going to, the security benefits are so much greater that it's a no-brainer to move towards it, to move in that direction.
Seems like you answered that. Whoever has the next panel, there's a whole bunch of encryption questions you guys should be looking at. Apparently, they think that this group can solve all problems, so we have to say thank you for that. So, Diane, what is it that your group's focusing on kind of in the next coming months? What is it that we should be looking at coming out of the ORAN Coalition?
Sure. So we are in our phase one, which is kind of getting out and meeting with as many people as we can, members of Congress, administration officials, White House. When we first started out on this path, we were thinking domestically, but with the additions of Telefonica, Vodafone, and others, we realized that we could have a global impact as well. So, because COVID, we were all home and doing video conferences, it has actually helped us. We're able to connect with our colleagues across the pond. The one nice thing about this situation is that we're all in it together. Everyone is extremely patient and understanding. So as we get up as a brand new organization in our growing pains, it's good that we're able to connect with folks all around the world and talk about these issues. I did a panel with folks in Brazil a couple of weeks ago, and so they're extremely interested to what we're doing in the United States and how they, in turn, can use our best practices to help them get started in their countries. So that's what we're focusing on internationally, is kind of what we're doing here. Are there best practices or standards that we can help export around the world? So again, it's education. It is focusing on what people are interested in and how we can plug into that. There are several ongoing filings in the US, whether it's the FCC, NTIA. We're trying to be as instrumental in those conversations as possible right now.
And I have a point of clarification, because I apparently didn't ask this last question correctly. the question was about authentication systems being recommended to protect against unauthorized access to 5G and IoT devices. So that's a lead on correction from my geolocation question.
Back to you, Paul.
So in terms of authentication, first of all, we do believe the data should be protected, whether it's at rest or in transit. We believe the data should be validated. And we also believe that devices should have the ability to log data. Now, to the extent that you want to implement different types of authentication, there's going to be, is really going to be too contextual for me to say that every type of device has to have it. I mean, you're going to have to start thinking about what kind of data does the device hold? Where is it being deployed? What does it access? What is it being used for? Is it a dog collar? Is it being used in an energy plant as some sort of control system? So I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer to any of these issues, but to the extent that there are things that apply across the ecosystem, there's going to be a measurable impact across the ecosystem once you see that these sorts of capabilities, which we've identified, start getting implemented. And one good place to start looking is the supplement, which we are releasing later this year, where it's actually going to show how the different capabilities that we've identified and which we've had, the leverage expertise of hundreds of different professionals looking at this and saying, yes, this is what we believe should be done. When you look at that map of how different best practices, different industry policies, different governments are actually implementing this, you are going to see progress.
Well, and I'm thinking at the device level, that's always the challenge because people wanted to come out of the box secure. But the first thing usually when you have a digitally connected device is it wants to update. It's like, I just bought, oh, it needs an update. Which just tells you kind of the layers that they're working on. Okay, now that we are at the top of our time, as a wrap up, can you, each of you just kind of give us an idea where you think we'll be in 12 months as it relates to 5G and IoT? Sujit, I'll start with you.
Well, look, greater deployment, greater innovation, greater partnerships between the government and the private sector. But there's got to be that energy behind it, right? I think everyone is saying all the right things. Now it's a question of implementation. So I know from the administration's point of view, we do have a national 5G strategy. We're in the process of implementing that. It's a very brief 10 to 11 page report. Now we've got a very detailed implementation plan involving pretty much all the different organs of the federal government. So my hope is 12 months from now, we've executed on what we've promised to do.
Absolutely. So Samsung has their 5G phone. Apple's about to release their 5G phone. We should have 100 large and medium-sized cities 5G ready by the end of the year. It's an exciting time to be in the tech space. Not only do we have this super highway that's being built, but we have that demand side that's already pushing down to be the next big app. So it's all coming in within that 12-month span.
Plus having our mail delivered to us by a drone.
In that car to take me to DC and to Annapolis, back and forth.
Where will the mail go right now? That's what address, and then the privacy implications. But that's somebody else's panel. Paul, where are we 12 months from now? IoT, 5G.
Well, we're going to continue making progress towards the international standard. And like I said, from the very beginning, we've known that the strength of our approach is different organizations being willing to collaborate jointly towards the security of our digital ecosystem, whether it's 5G, whether it's IoT. And that's why I thank IGF USA for the opportunity to have this discussion, to bring everyone together, because it's when you bring different stakeholders together that you can actually make progress in this space, especially when you're talking about engineers who are just really trying to make the ecosystem more secure. And I think that we're going to be in a much better place if we continue down this path.
Well, I want to thank you all for your time and commitment towards these important topics. I know I'm looking forward to, I'd like a drone to show up with coffee right now. That would be great. But I think actually a lot of us have more interest in drones just because we've been trapped inside, but we also appreciate how much our broadband connections are keeping us going, and can only imagine what's going to happen when they're going that much faster and less latency and and all that great stuff. So thank you. I just would, if I could, I'd ask the audience to thank my panelists. So I will just ask everyone to appreciate the time that you've dedicated towards this. And I hope that everybody knows that they can stay in touch with you on these really important issues.
Absolutely. Thanks, Shane.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Linda, handing it back over to you.